Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm just going to be doing a little roundup of all the books that I read in June, and in many ways this was again a sort of a month of two halves, as it were. See, I can do sporting terms. It's the Euros. I know what I'm talking about. So it was reading month of two halves in many ways, because the first half I was reading quite a lot. I at one point had like quite a few long coach journeys and like a bit of like transport, and was commuting and reading quite a lot. And the later part of this month I have just been stressed up to my eyeballs with work stuff and have not really fancied the idea of looking or doing anything else with my eyes after staring at a screen for sort of multiple hours. So that's not really happened. Even audiobooks have just been like, I'm not actually listening to what's happening. So been wandering through in a little bit of a haze. But all of that aside, here are the books that I read this month. And I realise again, I'm sort of saying that, and I've read 21 books this month, which again sounds like a lot, and it is, but many of them were very, very short and all sort of happened in this really brief period. I thought this was going to be a month where I was going to read absolutely ridiculous amounts, because I was sort of really racing through books at one point, but alas, consequences stopped me. So let's go through them. So I started off with the winner of the first ever Booker Prize, which is Something to Answer For by a man whose name I forgot, Eric Newby. PH Newby. Eric Newby is a different author. This book kind of charts him looking through sort of time in Egypt and kind of these various kind of various sort of competing characters and sort of competing interests in a very, very Booker way, particularly early Booker. This is very much the fall of the British Empire, and kind of looking at things like that. And so as we sort of see throughout the novel, there is this character who is sort of really struggling to sort of find his place in the world. Meanwhile, there are these sort of depictions of being an other, being this sort of Englishman in I want to say in Cairo, but in Egypt nonetheless, sort of things around Suez, like Suez Canal and many other sort of parts. I didn't necessarily fully gel with this. I think sometimes it feels like it's easy and fashionable almost to sort of bash on like older Booker Prize books, and especially some of the winners. This is a tricky one I found with this book, because I found that there was a lot to enjoy. Some of it's quite funny, it's really interesting in parts, but I just found overall it was this sort of relentless sort of set of descriptions that I found myself not really caring about. And I don't know if that's, again, it's sort of difficult to tell if that's a me problem or a book problem. I think it may be slightly more of a me problem, because I don't know, it was tricky. And I think it's an interesting one, because I think anyone kind of starting off and reading Booker Prize books in order would maybe read this one and be like, oh gosh, what have I got myself in for? So maybe it's good that I took a bit of time to come around to read this one. It just didn't gel with me, and that's fine, that happens. But it's interesting with other books I'm sort of slowly reading from that shortlist, to kind of get a sense of what the kind of early prizes were. And it should be noted, the first two prizes, there was apparently a particularly overbearing a woman, I think Dame Rebecca West, I'm not sure if I've got that wrong, who apparently spent quite a lot of, was basically quite domineering in the room, and would basically be like, no, not this book, no, not this one. She said of Iris Murdoch, every year she releases a book, and it's kind of on, every other one is good, essentially, and that sort of ruined her chances in one of the book prizes, and sort of helped her a tiny bit in one of the other ones. But essentially, it was, just her kind of way of sort of saying, this year is a bad year for Iris Murdoch, this is not a good Iris Murdoch book, discount this one immediately. And so it's sort of because of that this book perhaps potentially won. It's that's really not interesting to anyone apart from me, but long story short, didn't necessarily massively get on with this book. Next up, I read Jane Eyre, and I listened to this as an audiobook. I read Jane Eyre years ago and couldn't really remember all that much about it. And it's interesting for me coming back and rereading it, even as an audiobook, just because there's a lot about this book that I completely forgot about. So I think I sort of remembered the vague, you know, overview of the plot around this whole idea of, you know, she wants, there's a sort of this, you know, she's a governess, and then there's this sort of relationship that she's trying to kind of start with this man, and it's all a bit, you know, Mr. Rochester, and it's all kind of complicated and what have you, and eventually they sort of get together. I don't think I'd remembered. I think I basically remembered all of the middle part of the book and not the beginning or the end. So I'd forgotten entirely that she was a young child who was brought up as a sort of orphan or sort of distant cousin in a house where she was really not made to feel welcome, and how that sort of shaped her experiences of then being a much nicer governess later down the line to kind of almost rectify, you know, to put right what had been sort of done wrong to her. And then I think I'd forgotten about the end of the book, not to spoil it, but then also the book has been out for like almost 200 years, so, you know, but I think I'd almost forgotten about how she becomes this sort of caregiver right at the end. Like she, you know, with Mr. Rochester, I want to say it's Mr. Rochester. If I'm getting that entirely wrong, just insert correct name of male character here. But essentially, yeah, she sort of ends up looking after him when he sort of loses his sight, when he loses a lot of money. She suddenly comes into a lot of money, and it's this really interesting thing of watching her, you know, so much of the time she could have basically looked out for revenge, or she could have been out to destroy people who destroyed her. And what's so beautiful, I think, about this book is we have this character, Jane, at the heart of it, who has been treated so badly by so many people, and yet comes to the end and still is so full of heart and love and warmth. And I just really enjoyed that about this book. I don't think I'd remembered how powerfully written some of these scenes are, and it's gorgeous. And I mean, it feels almost redundant to sort of talk about a classic and talk about how brilliant it is in some ways, but I think I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed this book, and I don't think I maybe enjoyed it as much then as I do now. So I think there's something really quite special about this book. And then following on, well, I mean, this is not necessarily in chronological order, but it makes sense to include it here. Then I read Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, which in many ways is sort of a writing back, a kind of prequel to the book, and really focuses on Mr. Rochester's wife. And she is a woman who has been essentially brought up, I mean, she sort of lived in the Caribbean, she brought up in the Caribbean, and then had been moved over to the UK as Mr. Rochester's wife, and had kind of been and then had been basically trapped in an attic. And then there's this whole, it's really interesting reading Jane Eyre knowing that you're about to then read White Sargasso Sea, because you sort of hear these little rumblings about like, oh yes, you know, she's just in the attic, you know what she's like, heard from her family that she's crazy. And then when you read White Sargasso Sea, it's such an inventive and clever rewriting of that story, of thinking about actually she's not just some woman in an attic. She had a whole rich life, a whole really interesting and varied life, and then has been sort of brought over and kept in these horrible conditions. And even if she had sort of been struggling with her mental health before that, obviously locking her in an attic and isolating her from everyone in a country that's unfamiliar to her probably isn't going to help. And there's just such a gorgeous moment in Wide Sargasso Sea towards the end, which really focuses in on the fire. And I did a separate video on Jane Eyre and White Sargasso Sea, but a really beautiful passage towards the end where she's sort of losing grip of reality, and she sees the flames that are rising in the house as being like sort of bits of red fabric from a dress. And it's beautiful, but also absolutely terrifying, because you know what's happening. We know from Jane Eyre that fire happens, and then so many other parts of the plot come into play, and so many other things happen and change because of that moment. And it's so interesting to get that insight into a character who would otherwise have been sort of somewhat sidelined in that book. And Wide Sargasso Sea, as a result, really encourages us as the audience to apply a bit more of a post-colonial lens and a bit more of a critical lens to Jane Eyre, in looking at actually, you know, it's not just a case of a woman being brought over. This is part of you know, institutionalized abuse as part of the slave trade, and as part of, you know, so many other horrible historical moments. So really, really interesting that this book just kind of makes us think a little bit more differently about something like that. Then next I read Claire Fuller's Unsettled Ground. I'm going to do a separate, well, I've got a separate video coming out that is all about the Women's Prize shortlist, of which this book is one of the 6. And I absolutely adore this book. It is focused around these 2 twins in their 50s who essentially have to work out what their life is now after their mother sort of suddenly dies, and they suddenly realize that they've been told loads of lies, or at least they've been protected from certain truths throughout their lives. And as a result, you've got these 2 absolutely fascinating characters, because these 2 twins in their 50s, and firstly, we don't normally get that many stories focusing on twins who are older, you know, normally it's sort of twin children or whatever. And to watch these 2 adults in their 50s completely unable to do sort of some of the most basic, you know, things is so interesting. And I've heard a couple of interviews with Claire Fuller, and Eric over at Lonesome Reader has a really interesting video talking to Claire Fuller, and it's so interesting because I think her perspective and her sort of ideas in mind when creating this book were really quite fascinating, to think of this idea of what does it mean to be an adult who's unable to do some of these things. And Claire Fuller was saying that in her writing of this book, she really had to almost imagine every scene with what would it look like if I wasn't able to do this, and sort of really look at it critically as someone who can, for example, read and write, and think, actually, if the character couldn't read or write here, what would happen in this moment? And I think it takes such a wonderful bit of imagination to really be able to capture that so articulately and so clearly. And there's a real lingering sense of terror and dread that permeates this book. And for me, it was just absolutely masterful. I was completely blown away by how this book achieved that. Because at one point we know that violence is coming, and it is terrifying. It feels really physical. It kind of takes over, and I can't commend her enough for this book. I just think it's stunningly written and just such a gorgeous book. Which takes us on to another book from that same Women's Prize shortlist, which is No One Is Talking About This by Patricia Lockwood. Again, I'll talk a bit more in depth about this in the Women's Prize shortlist video coming up soon. But essentially this book goes into this sort of idea of what it means to be someone who is very much inside the internet in the current times. So someone who spends a lot of time on the internet. And I think what's so interesting, I mean, this book, again, for many people has been quite divisive, and I totally see why. The first half of the book is essentially written as almost mini sort of tweets or microblogs or what have you. And most of these thoughts feel very much like someone making little tweets or jokes in a moment. But I think what's so interesting is what we learn in the sort of spaces in between those. We learn so much about a character, even though everything is kind of coming in these sort of micro passages. And each of those passages sort of reveals the sort of how enmeshed this woman's life is with the internet. So much so that the second half of the book, which really looks at a kind of a much more real life example, as it were, suddenly throws everything into a really interesting perspective. We've got a woman who is almost so lost in the internet and is sort of this viral kind of sensation in some ways from a tweet, and kind of spends a lot of her life either on the internet or talking to people about being on the internet, or the portal as it is in this book. And what's so interesting is it kind of typifies this one sort of type of person almost, of someone who, because they're so lost in the internet, they so much of their thinking is shaped by it. And I kind of relate sometimes I related to parts of this book for the idea that, you know, sometimes there are situations that will happen and my mind will jump to a meme first before it jumps to anything else. And I thought that was really fascinating with this book, how that kind of captures that feeling of, at one point, again, I don't want to spoil anything, but at one point there's a sort of hospital scene, and one of the character's first thoughts is basically making some kind of sarcastic, sardonic wisecrack of a joke about how weird it is to see a baby's genitals on an ultrasound or something like that. And I mean, that's maybe not selling this book as well as it could, but it's interesting that that's where her mind goes first, that she makes these jokes first and then remembers the human element of everything. And in some ways that's really interesting, because the internet can be such a great way of people making those observations that you wouldn't otherwise get as much, but at the same time she almost seems to be losing herself and sort of is somewhat effaced by the internet as well. So I think this is a really interesting book. Again, I see why it's divisive, but I think it does some really exciting and interesting things. Next up was a book called One of Them by Musa Okwonga. So I have been following Musa for a little while. He does some quite interesting, just sort of blogs and poems of his from ages ago. He's a really interesting writer, sort of a black British man who now lives, I believe, in Berlin. And I think he's released another book this year, which is a sort of more of a book more focused on sexuality. But in One of Them, he describes what it was like being essentially a young black boy at Eton, the sort of big private school in the UK, which is seen as a bit of a factory for the upper class, and we're talking upper class, not just like upper middle, like upper class. Often kind of, you know, so many British politicians will have gone to Eton and then on to Oxford or Cambridge, and it's kind of known for being quite exclusive. And so this young black boy from London, or from just outside London, I think he is, and he kind of is there, and it's such an interesting memoir looking at his experiences of trying to find his way through it, and against people, you know, I say against, but kind of alongside people who have had just the most ridiculous amounts of privilege to be able to get there, you know, whose families own vast empires of kind of like factories and various industries. Even there's at one point a really interesting moment where Musa recounts how he met someone, you know, the sort of racism he was sort of facing on a fairly regular basis in some ways from sort of internally, and that real feeling of not belonging because he's black, because he's from a less wealthy background, even though his parents are sort of, you know, doing their absolute utmost to be able to afford his fees for him to go. And what was so interesting about that is at one point we learned that, you know, he never hears it directly from this man's mouth, this young boy's mouth, but essentially that this boy's great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather had owned slaves. And when there's then this sort of tension and argument between these two boys, it's really strange for Musa to know that this boy has that information and has that sort of history in his family, but also wants to wield it as a weapon in arguments with Musa, but never does because he realizes it might cross a line, but knows at the same time that he's only, you know, only about this much sort of polite kind of respectability is holding him back from saying this abhorrent thing to Musa. So really, you know, some big kind of topics to grapple with within this book. And I think what's so interesting about it is he's so candid about what it felt like to be a young boy in that scenario, but he also doesn't really seem to pity himself or anything like that in the situation. He sees himself as being someone who is just really trying to eke out a kind of existence in amongst all of this, you know, against people who have wildly different lives to his own. I mean, it's just so interesting because it's not something we often get that many insights into, particularly an outsider's sort of insight into. So really interesting book. Next up, I read John McGregor's Lean, Fall, Stand. And so John McGregor is not an author I've actually read anything of before, but I know that I think Reservoir 13 is sort of a book that he's a bit better known for. And Lean, Fall, Stand came out this year and is about sort of Arctic explorers who, and especially one who is sort of basically after almost dying, has to sort of try and piece his life back together. And very much we're talking piece absolutely everything of his life back together, learning how to walk again, learning how to talk and sort of make sense. And we get all these really fascinating scenes of people in a sort of rehabilitation group who are all trying to piece together their patterns of speech, how they do anything after having strokes. And it's brutal in a lot of ways, this book, but does some really interesting things. I don't think I was fully sold on some parts of it, but I do think it does a fair few bits really beautifully. And it's so interesting watching this character really struggle to to find the words to be able to express the horrors that happened, and you almost sometimes want him to not be able to recover, because you almost know that him saying those, you know, having the words to talk about what happened might actually make him feel even worse. And, you know, a few moments where he's sort of put up to not necessarily trial, but that, you know, a jury wants to hear what happened and whether he accidentally caused the death of others, and he's sort of trying to articulate that while also not having recovered. Yeah, really interesting and really brutal book in many ways. Next up were a couple of books that I've also covered in a recent video with my Ian McEwan video, and so no surprise, these are both by Ian McEwan. The first is Enduring Love, which is all about someone basically who, after a hot air balloon incident, hence the little slightly creepy picture, was sort of falls sort of madly in what he sees as love, but is basically an obsession, a sort of stalker-like obsession with this other man. And it's really quite gripping throughout the book that we constantly see this character being kind of on the fringes and starting to lose essentially anything that happens. He can sort of attribute it to a sign that they're meant to be together. So if the main character closes his curtains, this character reads that as being a sign. If he leaves them open, that's also a sign. But almost all of these signs lead back to, oh, you love me, and we're meant to be together. And then it's tied in with a sort of religious aspect. So this man with the obsession of sort of de Clerambault's syndrome is so obsessed with the idea of this man that he sees it as a God-given sort of duty for these two men to be together, but that it's, you know, that they're trying to resist. And if the main character, who we hear everything through, if he says, you know, I don't love you, I don't even know you, stay away from me, the other character sees that, you know, the obsessed character sees that as him trying to resist what he knows is fate. And that means that they definitely should be together, because he's sort of just trying to, he wants it so badly that he's rebelling against it. And so he basically can't win. And it's so interesting because we see throughout the book as increasingly everyone around him starts doubting him. And we as the reader start to doubt him as well, because in some ways, some parts of his story seem not to make sense. Why is he not telling his girlfriend about various moments? Why is he not, why is he still meeting this person every so often when he could just ignore him? Why is he not doing other things that seem to be logical, but, you know, it just never quite happened? And so it's really interesting. It's such a really well done book, I think. And one of the last Ian McEwan books, I'd sort of read everything. I think I've now read all of his novels. And this was one that I just had been meaning to read for years and just had never quite got around to. So Enduring Love by Ian McEwan. Pretty interesting. Pretty good going. And then next I read Black Dogs, also by Ian McEwan, which was shortlisted for a Booker. You may again see a theme. This is always a theme. I don't know why I say this like it's a surprise. But Black Dogs covers a really interesting period around sort of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the kind of collapse of the Soviet Empire and all of that kind of time period, the sort of late 80s, early 90s, that very critical historical time. And this was released in 1992, so very kind of on the pulse of the moment. And the sort of titular Black Dog is something that this sort of the main character's mother talks about and references quite a lot, but nobody else really seems to understand what's happened. And we're kind of meant to believe as an audience that maybe the Black Dog was kind of her way of thinking about something, kind of in some ways almost like in The Life of Pi, where is this the version of reality that their mind has settled on to make a painful experience seem a bit more abstract or a bit more tangible sometimes in some ways. You know, which way does it fall? Or is it just that she was actually attacked by black dogs? And it's a really interesting book. I don't think it always necessarily worked for me, but it does do some really interesting things in a really short space of time. It's about 160 pages or so. It's a really interesting book. But yeah, it kind of goes into that idea of why did this couple break up? What is sort of behind all of this? And, you know, will this son of theirs ever find out the real truth for why his parents basically got together and then broke up almost immediately? And this sort of unspoken secret between them both. And then next, partly because it was Pride Month and partly just because I've been meaning to read this book for the absolute longest time, I read Queer Intentions by Amelia Abraham. And this book is a sort of personal essay almost and sort of journey. I mean, the subtitle is A Personal Journey Through LGBTQ plus culture. And it basically does sort of deliver that. It's Amelia Abraham, who was sort of working as a sort of jobbing sort of journalist and kind of writer. And she sort of travels through various parts of the world, mostly the US, the UK, and pardon me, and various other parts of Europe. And it's her way of looking at what it means to be a queer person in the current day and age, and also what queer culture might look like going forward. So she focuses quite a lot of the book, for example, on marriage and the idea of equal marriage and whether the tide is turning in how we talk about some of these things. How years ago there was some resistance, and still sometimes is, from people within queer communities about equal marriage, because there's a fear that it's a kind of assimilation of kind of, you know, you're only valid, certain relationship types are only valid once they're sponsored by the state and once it's kind of given that seal of approval. And also, you know, the idea of should the ultimate goal of queer liberation be to sort of assimilate with non-queer people? Should that be the end goal, or is the end goal to be able to sort of break up sort of traditional rhythms of what a relationship looks like, or what partnership looks like, or what sex looks like? Should those things as sort of ideas be exploded? And so this book does a really interesting thing of tracing that through, and she interviews quite a few married couples. She talks to quite a few, you know, she's there at the beginning for, I think, the first same-sex marriage in the UK. And it's really interesting watching her perspective kind of unfold as she sort of talks about it. And she meets queer performers and drag performers, and she meets sort of people who are struggling for rights in communities. So I think she goes to Serbian Pride in Belgrade and talks about how people there are, you know, fighting just to be able to not be sort of homophobically attacked, never mind thinking of a longer term goal of marriage or whatever else. And by doing so, I think she can really contextualizes what queer liberation actually looks like. That ultimately, if the goal is for people to live without fear, what do we need to do to create that? Because it can't just be legislated. It needs to be also hearts and minds. But those hearts and minds, it can't just be great, queer people exist and we're okay with that. It needs to almost be that step further of how does society fundamentally need to shift for us to no longer see queer people as others? And also, is there a way for queer people to exist in a way that isn't othering or othered in a society? So really interesting book, and it does some really interesting things. She threads quite a lot of her own relationships through the book as well, and I found it really quite interesting to have that insight into what it looked like for her, because one of her relationships starts, the book that we learn, the relationship we learn about right at the beginning of the book, starts so passionately and so intensely, and then very quickly falls apart. And part of the reason it almost seems to fall apart as well is when it seems to be moving towards a very settled, very quote unquote heteronormative existence. So when it looks like 2.4 children, a picket fence, you know, a family and a dog, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So really, really interesting book, and I just think it does some really quite fascinating things. Next up, I read two books by Bernice Rubens, who was the second ever winner of the Booker Prize. So one of those books I did read was that exact book, which is The Elected Member. So this is all about a young man who, well, I say young, I think he's in his sort of, is he in his sort of mid to late 40s when we meet him? I mean, that's still fairly young in the grand scheme of things, but, you know, he is sort of going through a bit of a crisis. He basically was a high-performing lawyer, and he is in this sort of Jewish family and sort of really surrounded by this Jewish community in London, I believe it is. And all the way through, it's so interesting because he's basically having a bit of a mental breakdown. He really needs a sort of sense of support, but the kind of community around him is finding it really hard to sort of engage with what that all looks like. partly because this is, I think, sort of set in the 60s, in which case, you know, it's kind of difficult, as you know, there was a lot less understanding, and still, you know, so many gaps in understanding about what it means to be sort of struggling in that way, but also the sort of pressure around him. You know, he had a high-powered legal career. There seems to be this sort of family push towards excellence and success, and his father is a rabbi, and so his father has a really interesting perspective because essentially he's also seen as a sort of pillar of the community, and so he sort of feels the sense of shame quite acutely of this. I will say this is just such an interestingly and funnily written book. The rabbi character speaks almost entirely in a sort of a very heavily accented second language English. So he sort of peppers in quite a lot of Yiddish phrases as he speaks. There are kind of a few bits where his sort of English is clearly not sort of as native. And it's interestingly done because a lot of humor is brought out, not kind of laughing at him, but kind of he's sort of got this outsider perspective that's really fascinating on everything going on around him. And it's just a really well written and really funnily written book for what is essentially quite a dark topic. And it explores what that looks like and sort of how mental ill health affects the family, but also manages to still somehow feel quite light and quite, not necessarily breezy, but kind of accessible throughout, and it's really interesting. However, the next book of hers that I read was one that I adored even more and just thought was such a stunning book, and that is A 5-Year Sentence. And this book I just thought was extraordinary from basically the first page, and then continued to love. So we open the book with the main character wanting to take her life. She is going into her last day at work, and she basically sees no point in continuing her life after this. She has no plans. She doesn't intend to make plans. Her life stops there as far as she's concerned. But the present that she is given as a leaving gift, which she at first sort of snarks about a little bit, and this book is quite snarky in a way that I really love. The present she is given is a 5-year diary, and hence the title of this book. And she suddenly finds herself unable to really think about anything else. And she suddenly thinks, well, it'll be rude to die now when I've got this diary. I should fill the diary at least first. And it basically buys her 5 more years of life. And she starts off the diary by writing a few sort of to-do list items, or kind of writing what she's done rather over the day, and then she kind of looks back at it and she's like, this is dull, nothing really matters. And she sort of takes a bit of a gamble one day and she writes something for the next day as being done, something that really is kind of challenging herself to go out there and go beyond it. I think it was basically to ask someone out, I think it was. And then so suddenly she finds herself the next day thinking, well, gosh, I've got to make this come true. So she goes out and she basically sort of chats up this man. And this starts a huge sort of shift in everything within the book. What essentially transpires is the man who she starts sort of seeing suddenly realizes he can make money off of her, to try and put his sort of mother, who's sort of overbearing and who he seemingly at this point hates, into a fancy retirement home just so she stops complaining. This is where the snark gets really heavy because it is brutal in some ways. You really viscerally feel how much this man is sort of dissatisfied with his life and seems to blame a lot of it on his ailing mother. But it's weird because that sounds harsh, and it is, but it's weirdly done in quite a funny way. Anyway, so she starts up this sort of relationship and he starts charging her essentially almost as some kind of rent boy or sort of male sex worker, to do various, at first, very kind of tame acts. So, for example, holding hands will cost a penny, and if she wants sort of like a small sort of touch on the arm, that might be 2 pennies. And this list goes on, and we're sort of very coyly told, and very, very coyly not told, what's at the end of that list, but I think we can all then grasp what might be the most expensive acts. And it's so interestingly done because this man then branches out and gets a second client. And so meanwhile, this sort of woman is kind of giving up all of her money to sort of have these moments, and she's putting these things in a diary to sort of challenge herself. to do these things, but at the same time this man is basically exploiting her, and he's also exploiting someone else. And I don't want to spoil it, but towards the end of the book there is such a fascinating and funny sort of showdown as everything starts to crumble, as she gets towards the end of her 5 years, and it's just brilliant. It's so funny, it's so dark. Like, it is a very dark book. Like, if you take out any of the humor of this book is thoroughly depressing. But what I think makes this so fantastic is there is such a lightness of humor throughout, that even though we are watching someone go through absolute hell, we're watching several people go through absolute hell, there is a real funniness to how it's handled that kind of charms you. And I think this book is brilliant. I think it's obviously not released this year, but I think one of my favorite books that I've read so far this year. I was just in love with it. I just think it's brilliant. And it makes me really want to check out more of Bernice Rubens now, because from these two books I think there's a lot to love. So yeah, really, really interesting. Next up, I listened to an audiobook of Fire from Heaven by Mary Renault. And this was nominated for the Lost Man Booker Prize and in 1970. And this book is essentially all about tracing Alexander the Great as a young boy. And sort of as he, I think it was then part of a trilogy or a quartet that kind of traced all of this kind of life of Alexander the Great and these kind of myths and legends that sort of surrounded him. And especially for a character who is sort of so historically, not necessarily celebrated, but, you know, there are sort of so many stories told about him. I think this book does something really quite special in creating a very real and believable story, whilst also, you know, this young boy rising up through the ranks and fighting in wars and killing people, but also there kind of being this sort of mythical element of it kind of being ordained by the gods and all that kind of stuff. So I think this book does this really successfully and really interestingly. I will say, I'm not sure, increasingly as I was sort of listening to this, I was like, I am starting to feel like I'm maybe not made for Greek myths and fairy tales. And this is not to say that I'll never read them. I do really enjoy when I read them. I really enjoyed a book by Natalie Haynes, the title of which I've entirely forgotten. And I do enjoy them when I'm reading them. I think my issue with it is I can never remember any of the characters from any of the millions of Greek myths and fairy tales and legends. And so people would sort of just be like, you know, yes, this character is mentioned. I'm like, that is a name. That is a name of a person / god / deity / interesting spiritual body, and I can't remember what I meant to know about them. That's, again, definitely a me problem. That is not the book. The book goes out of its way to really explain who these people are. I'm just a bit dense. But I really do struggle with them. I think, in fairness, you may notice from many of the books that I talk about that are my favourites, they normally involve one or two main characters and everything is focused on their inner worlds. And that's how I like it, because I cannot remember more than about two characters. And even when there are only about two characters, I forget their names. I'm a terrible reader. But it's still something I find really interesting, and I'm really glad that I listened to this book. It's, again, something a bit more outside of my immediate kind of comfort zone or like reading preferences, but the writing of this story is so beautiful. The way the characters speak amongst themselves, these sort of like bawdy kind of humor moments of sort of men talking amongst themselves, are really beautifully rendered. The battle scenes are really dynamic and powerful. Yeah, it's a really interesting book, and I see why it was one of those books that when it came to the Lost Man Booker Prize, so books that were released in, I believe, 1969 or 1970 that would have been eligible for the Booker Prize if they'd stayed in the same rules, but they changed rules and suddenly loads of books weren't eligible anymore. And so this was one of those books that fell through the cracks at the time, but I totally see why a few years down the line, or many years down the line, this was a book that was still seen as being important and worth going back to read and look at and reappraise. So yeah, there we go. I'm just going to pause that one there because this is going to get very, very long otherwise. So this will be just the end of the first part, and then I'll follow this up shortly with a second part going into some more of the books that I read over June. Thank you and take care. I hope you enjoyed this so far, and please do let me know if you've read any of these books and if you enjoyed any of them. Thank you and take care. Bye-bye.